Hey guys, tonight we are drinking in a medieval tavern, and it is going to be a long night. We are stepping into a world that smells like smoke, wet wool, and the accumulated life choices of 40 people who consider a weekly bath ambitious. The movies gave you oak beams and roaring fires, and foaming tankards slid across a polished bar. The reality is going to correct that image aggressively over the next 2 hours. Here is something they never mention in the storybook version. In medieval England, if your ale was judged to be substandard, the punishment was not a fine. It was being strapped into a wooden chair and publicly dunked into a river while the neighborhood watched. Your drink had consequences, just not for you. Before we settle in, like and subscribe if you enjoy these, and drop a comment letting me know where you are tuning in from tonight. I always love seeing where these stories end up. Now dim the lights. Switch on a fan for that soft background hum. Get yourself comfortable, and let your shoulders finally drop away from your ears. Tonight is a long one, so just settle in, let the screen do its thing, and we will take it from here. Why did everyone drink ale instead of water, including children? Was the expensive wine actually better, or was it just more likely to be watered down and spoiled? What did the tavern actually smell like when 40 people and zero ventilation shared a room? Who owned these places, and who carried all the risk? How much did a night out cost in actual days of labor? What were the laws about how long you could stay, and how drunk you were allowed to get? What happened to the tavern keeper who could not keep up with the rent? And what was the food like? Because that answer is going to surprise you. 1380-something, London. You are sitting on a bench in a room that smells like smoke and spilled ale and ambition, and a wooden cup has just appeared in front of you. Let us see how tonight goes. So, you are here. You are inside a medieval tavern, and the first thing you need to do is forget every image you have ever seen of one. Forget the movie set. Forget the video game inn with the chandelier and the long polished bar, and the mysteriously clean barmaid pouring ale into a gleaming tankard. That version does not exist. It has never existed. What you are sitting in right now is, essentially, someone's front room. That is not a metaphor. Most taverns in 14th century England were not purpose-built establishments. They were ordinary houses. Someone, usually a woman, brewed ale in the back of her home and opened the front room to anyone willing to pay for a cup. There was no sign above the door in the way you are imagining. What there was, in many cases, was an ale stake. A long pole stuck out horizontally from the front of the building, sometimes with a bush or a bundle of greenery tied to the end. That was the signal. If you saw the pole, the house was selling ale. If you did not see the pole, you kept walking. It was the medieval equivalent of an open sign in a shop window, except the shop was also where the owner slept, cooked, argued with her husband, and stored everything she owned. The room you are sitting in right now is small, low ceiling, thick timber beams you can almost reach up and touch, though you probably should not, because they are black with years of accumulated soot and grease. The walls may be lime-washed, which sounds clean until you realize lime wash just means a thin coat of chalky white over whatever was underneath, and what was underneath has not been addressed in a while. There are benches along the walls, maybe a table, maybe two. The seating arrangement is communal. You do not get your own space here. You sit where there is room, next to whoever is already sitting there, and you make your peace with the fact that personal space is a concept that will not be invented for several hundred years. The light is coming from the fire, maybe a tallow candle or two, but tallow candles are made from animal fat, and they smell exactly like what they are, which is animal fat slowly burning. Beeswax candles smell better, but cost significantly more, and this is not the kind of establishment that invests in ambiance. The fire is the main event. It is doing the heating, the lighting, and a fair amount of the cooking, all at once, and the smoke is going roughly in the direction of a hole in the roof or a chimney if you are lucky. If you are not lucky, and you are frequently not lucky, the smoke is just generally present. It sits in the room like an uninvited guest who will not leave, and everyone has quietly agreed to stop mentioning. This is your tavern, not a set piece, not a theme restaurant. A working room, in a working house, in a city that smells like a city, doing its best with what it has. And honestly, once your eyes adjust and the fire settles and you stop comparing it to places that will not exist for 6 centuries, it is not terrible. It is warm. It is full of people. Someone is talking too loudly about something that does not concern you. The ale is on its way. There are worse places to spend an evening. But before you get comfortable on that bench, you should probably know what you are sitting above, because the floor situation in a medieval tavern is a topic that deserves its own conversation and, frankly, a moment of emotional preparation. You might be imagining stone, maybe packed earth, maybe rough wooden planks, and any of those are possible. But in a great many establishments, what you would actually find underfoot is rushes, dried reeds and grasses spread across the floor in a layer that sounds, at first, almost pleasant, rustic, charming even, like a farmhouse in a painting. Here is where it stops being charming. The rushes were not regularly replaced. Not fully, anyway. The common practice was to throw a fresh layer of rushes on top of the old layer, and the old layer, and the older layer beneath that. Erasmus, writing a bit later, but describing a practice that had been entrenched for generations, painted a picture that is difficult to forget once you have heard it. The bottom layers of those rushes contained spit, spilled ale, scraps of food, fish bones, dog urine, and what he politely described as other filth, all quietly composting underneath a thin, cheerful layer of fresh greenery on top. You are essentially sitting above a lasagna of human and animal waste with garnish. The smell would have been exactly what you are now imagining it was. Sweet, sour, biological, layered, and completely normal to everyone in this room except you. Nobody here is recoiling. Nobody is wrinkling their nose. This is just what a floor is. The idea that a floor should be a hard, clean, washable surface is so far in the future that suggesting it here would get you a genuinely confused look, possibly followed by a question about whether you are feeling all right. The modern equivalent would be if your local pub never mopped. Not once, just threw a fresh tablecloth over the existing situation every few weeks and called the matter resolved. Except the tablecloth is grass, and the situation underneath has been developing a personality for months. And yet, you adjust. That is what people do, and have always done. The rushes under your feet are soft enough, the fire is warm, the ale is coming, and the floor, whatever is happening inside it, is at least not your problem to fix. You are a guest here. You just have to sit on top of it and try not to think about the archaeology developing beneath your boots. Speaking of which, that cup has arrived. It has been placed in front of you without ceremony by a woman who is already moving to the next bench, and it is full of something thick and cloudy and room temperature. This is ale, and it is nothing like beer. That distinction matters more than you think. The drink in your hand has no hops in it. Hops, the ingredient that gives modern beer its bitterness and its ability to last, are not part of this recipe. What you are holding is a brew made from malted grain, water, and sometimes a mix of herbs and spices called gruit. The result is sweeter than you expect, thicker than you want, slightly sour, and beginning to go off from the moment it was made. This ale has a shelf life of about 3 days, maybe 4 if the weather is cool. After that, it turns, and not in a gentle, vinegary, still technically drinkable way. It turns in a way that lets you know, unmistakably, that the window has closed. This is why ale was brewed constantly, not in large batches stored for the season, the way a modern brewery operates, but in small batches, in someone's home, several times a week. Brewing was not a scheduled industrial process. It was closer to baking bread. It happened because it had to happen, because the last batch was nearly gone, and the next one needed to be ready before the current supply crossed the line from drink to punishment. And everyone drank it. Everyone. Men, women, children, clergy, laborers, merchants, the elderly, the young, everyone. Not because medieval England was a civilization of enthusiastic alcoholics, though that reputation has certainly stuck, but because the alternative was the water supply. And the water supply in a 14th century city was, to put this as gently as possible, an active threat to your continued existence. The rivers that ran through London carried sewage, animal waste, industrial runoff from tanneries and dye works, and whatever else the city could not be bothered to dispose of properly. Wells were better, but not reliably better. Nobody understood bacterial contamination. Nobody knew why water from one well made you sick and water from another did not. What they did understand, from long and painful collective experience, was that people who drank ale tended to survive, and people who drank water sometimes did not. The brewing process, which required boiling the water, killed the bacteria. Nobody knew that was why it worked. They just knew it worked. So ale was not a luxury. It was not a vice. It was a public health measure that nobody recognized as a public health measure. A gallon of basic ale cost roughly a penny. A laborer earned about 2 pence a day. That means a gallon of ale, enough to get a person through the day, because water was not safely on the table, represented about half a day's wages. Think about that for a moment. Imagine spending half your daily income on the minimum safe hydration available to you. Not because you want to, because the tap water might actually kill you. It is the medieval version of being charged for the privilege of not getting sick, which, if you think about it, is a tradition that has aged unfortunately well. The ale in your cup is weak by modern standards. The version you are drinking, sometimes called small ale or small beer, has a low enough alcohol content that drinking it all day will not incapacitate you. Stronger versions exist, much stronger. But for daily consumption, for the drink that children are given at breakfast and that workers carry into the fields, the ale is mild. It is fuel, it is hydration. It is the background hum of medieval life, not a Friday night event. And the person who made it is the person you should probably know about next, because her story is the one that holds this entire system together and costs her more than it costs anyone else in this room. The woman who brewed your ale is called an alewife, and she is everywhere. In the 14th century, brewing was domestic work. It happened in private homes, it was done primarily by women, and it was woven into the fabric of daily household labor, alongside cooking, cleaning, and everything else that kept a medieval family alive. The alewife brewed in her own kitchen, or in a small outbuilding behind her house. She used her own grain, her own fuel, her own time, and her own equipment. She sold the ale from her front room, which, as you already know, is the room you are currently sitting in. She is the tavern. The tavern is her house. The business and the home are the same building, the same budget, the same life. And the entire system depends on her doing this work consistently, reliably, and cheaply. But here is where it gets heavy. The alewife operated under one of the most tightly controlled regulatory frameworks in medieval England. The Assize of ale, first established in the 13th century, dictated the price of ale relative to the price of grain. She did not set her own prices. The law set them for her. If grain was expensive, she was allowed to charge a little more. If grain was cheap, the price of ale came down with it. Her margins were not hers to decide. On top of the fixed prices, she was subject to inspection. The ale tasters, and we will get to them shortly, had the authority to enter her premises, taste her product, check her measures, and report her for any violation. If she was caught selling short measure, if the ale was judged too weak, if her prices were a fraction above the legal limit, she was fined. If she was fined repeatedly, the punishment escalated, and at the top of that escalation, for the alewife who could not or would not meet the standard, sat the cucking stool. The cucking stool was a real device, used in real English towns and cities across the medieval period. It was a chair, sometimes attached to a long beam, positioned over a body of water. The convicted woman was strapped in and dunked, publicly, while the community watched. The number of dunkings could vary. The humiliation did not. This was not a quaint historical footnote. This was the regulatory consequence for a woman whose ale was not good enough. And she absorbed this risk alone. The landlord who collected her rent was not ducked. The crown that collected licensing fees was not fined. The grain merchant who set the price of her raw materials faced no consequences for charging her more. The entire chain above her, every person and institution that extracted money from her labor, was insulated from the punishment that fell exclusively on her. She brewed before dawn. She sold all day. She cleaned, maintained, and managed a business that was also her home. She fed her family from the same budget that funded her grain purchases. And if the product was judged to be inadequate by a man who tested it by sitting in it, which is a sentence we will return to shortly, she was the one who paid, not in money, in public humiliation and physical punishment. There is a word for a system where the person doing the most work bears the most risk, while everyone above them collects safely. Several words, actually. But in 1480-something London, it was just called the ale trade. And speaking of sitting in ale, let us talk about the man whose job that actually was. Because medieval England did not leave quality control to chance. It left quality control to a man in leather trousers and a bench. The ale taster was an official civic appointment. This was not a casual favor someone did for the neighborhood. It was a real position, recorded in real municipal records, carried out by a real person, whose job title was, genuinely, ale taster. His responsibility was to visit alehouses, taste the product, verify that the measures were honest, and report any violations to the local court. He was, in the most literal possible sense, a medieval health inspector, except his inspection method would get a modern health inspector fired, arrested, and possibly studied. The test, as recorded in several accounts from the period, went something like this. All was poured onto a flat wooden bench. The taster, wearing leather breeches, sat down in the puddle of ale. He stayed there for a set period of time. Then he stood up. If the breeches stuck to the bench, the ale was good. It had enough sugar or malt content to pass inspection. If the breeches did not stick, the ale was too weak, and the alewife was in trouble. That was the system. That was not a joke someone made up to embarrass the past. That was the regulatory mechanism by which the quality of the most widely consumed beverage in medieval England was officially assessed. A man sat in your drink and then stood up, and your livelihood depended on whether his trousers stuck to the furniture. The modern equivalent would be if a restaurant health inspector evaluated your food by rubbing it on his shirt and checking the stain, and then had the legal authority to shut you down based on the results. And everyone around him nodded and agreed that yes, this was the correct and proper way to handle the matter. The ale taster also checked measures. Ale was sold in standardized quantities, and selling short was a finable offense. He would arrive unannounced, demand a serving, and verify it against the legal standard. If the cup was light, if the price was wrong, if the ale did not pass the bench test, the alewife was reported, and the court date followed. The taster was not paid handsomely for this work. It was often a compulsory civic duty, something you were assigned whether you wanted it or not. Imagine being told by your local government that your new job is to visit every pub in the district, drink their product, sit in it, and then file paperwork, and you are doing this for free. The ale tasters held real power over the women who brewed. A bad report meant fines. Repeated bad reports meant the cucking stool, and the judgment was, by any reasonable modern standard, almost entirely subjective. The stickiness of a man's trousers is not what most people would call a precision instrument, which means the alewife's fate depended not just on her brewing skill, but on the mood, the appetite, the personal relationships, and the trouser fabric of the man assigned to evaluate her. It was not a fair system, but it was the system. And it operated across England for centuries, which tells you less about the quality of the ale and more about the fact that once a bureaucracy establishes a process, it will defend that process long after everyone involved has forgotten why it made sense in the first place. That particular instinct, at least, has not aged a single day. Now you have been drinking ale because ale is what this room runs on, but there is another drink available tonight, if you have the money. And if you order it, every person on this bench is going to know exactly what you are trying to say about yourself. Wine in medieval England was an import. Almost all of it came from the vineyards of Gascony, in southwestern France, shipped across the Channel in large barrels, and distributed through a network of merchants, middlemen, and tavern keepers who each took their cut along the way. England had a few domestic vineyards, mostly attached to monasteries, but the climate was not cooperative and the output was small. If you were drinking wine in London in the 1380s, it had almost certainly traveled a long way to reach your cup, and the journey was not kind to it. Wine in this period had no sulfites, no modern preservation, and no temperature-controlled storage. It was sealed in wooden barrels with varying degrees of competence and shipped across open water on vessels that took days or weeks to make the crossing, depending on weather. By the time it reached London, it had been exposed to heat, cold, salt air, motion, and time. Some of it was fine, a lot of it was not. Sour, vinegary, cloudy, or simply flat. The wine that arrived in English ports was frequently a shadow of what had been loaded onto the ship. And yet, people bought it. People bought it at extraordinary cost. In fact, specifically because it was expensive, and imported, and associated with the French court, and the nobility, and everything that said you were not the sort of person who drank penny ale with the laboring class. Wine was not ordered because it tasted better. It was ordered because it cost more. And everyone in the room knew exactly what that meant. A gallon of average Gascon wine in the 14th century cost somewhere around 8 pence. Compare that to ale at a penny a gallon. That is an 8-fold markup for a product that was, in many cases, measurably worse. A laborer earning 2 pence a day would need to work 4 full days to afford a single gallon of wine. 4 days of physical labor for a drink that might taste like it had been stored next to a wet saddle. But the laborer was not the target customer. The merchant, the minor gentleman, the traveling official, these were the men who ordered wine, and they did it the way someone today orders the bottle instead of the glass at a restaurant. Not because it is the smart choice, because it is the visible choice. The cheapest drink in the room was the freshest, the safest, and the most reliably brewed. The expensive imported option was the one most likely to be spoiled, watered down, or adulterated by someone along the supply chain who realized the customer was paying for the idea of wine rather than the quality of it. Ordering the expensive drink when the cheap one was better is a tradition that has not missed a single century. Bottle service energy is, it turns out, medieval. And here is a detail that might surprise you. The word tavern, technically, did not mean what you think it means. In legal terms, a tavern was specifically an establishment licensed to sell wine. An alehouse sold ale. The two were distinct categories with different licensing requirements, different regulations, and different social expectations. A tavern, in the strict sense, was a step above an alehouse. It served a wealthier clientele, operated under a wine license from the crown, and carried a certain status that the alehouse did not. When you hear the word tavern and imagine a rough, rowdy drinking hall, you are actually picturing the alehouse. The tavern, legally speaking, was the slightly more respectable cousin, not by much, but enough that the distinction mattered to the people inside. You have your drink sorted. Ale if you are sensible, wine if you are showing off, and either way, the cup is in front of you, and it is not going back empty. But something is happening in the room that your stomach has started to notice. Because the fire has been going all evening, and someone, somewhere nearby, is cooking. The assumption most people carry about medieval tavern food is that it was gray, flavorless, sad fuel eaten purely to prevent death, with all the culinary ambition of a punishment. The word gruel gets thrown around. People imagine watery porridge and stale bread, and a general atmosphere of nutritional misery. Here is the thing. That is not what is happening in this room, and it is not what is happening on the street outside, either. Most taverns and alehouses did not serve elaborate meals. That part is true. This is a drinking establishment first, and the alewife running it has enough to manage without also operating a kitchen. But medieval London had a thriving food economy that existed alongside and around the drinking establishments, and it was significantly better than the reputation it has been saddled with. Cookshops lined the streets near busy tavern areas. These were commercial kitchens, open to the street, selling prepared food to anyone with a few pennies. Roasted meats turning on spits. Hot pies with crusts thick enough to hold their filling without a plate. Bread, fresh or close to it, from the baker down the road. Cheese that ranged from soft and mild to hard and salty, depending on what you could afford. Pottage, which was a thick stew of whatever vegetables, grains, and scraps of meat were available, simmered for hours, and sold by the bowl. The smell alone would reach you from 2 streets away. And the seasoning. This is the myth that needs the most aggressive correction. Medieval food was not unseasoned. It was not beige. It was not the flavorless survival ration that modern people have decided to believe in. Spices were expensive, yes, and the rarest ones, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, were reserved for the wealthy. But salt was widely available. Mustard was common and cheap. Herbs grew in domestic gardens across England. Garlic, onion, parsley, sage, thyme. These were not exotic luxuries. They were ingredients that the average cook used regularly, because food that tastes like nothing is food that nobody wants to eat, and medieval people wanted to eat well for exactly the same reasons you do. A cookshop pie in 1480-something London might contain mutton or pork seasoned with salt, pepper, and herbs, baked inside a dense pastry shell designed more for structural integrity than for eating, though plenty of people ate the crust too. A modern food blogger would photograph it in soft light and call it a rustic hand pie and charge you £9 for it at a farmer's market. The cookshop sold it for a penny or two and did not bother with the presentation because nobody here has invented the concept of plating. You could bring food into the tavern. That was normal. The alewife was selling you ale, not a dining experience. You walked down the street, bought a pie or a bowl of pottage from the cookshop, brought it back to your bench, and ate it alongside your drink. The cookshop to tavern pipeline was the medieval version of ordering delivery to a bar. Different infrastructure, same impulse, same human being who wants a drink and a meal in the same location and does not particularly care about the logistics of how both arrive at the table. The food was not what you expected. It was better, more varied, more seasoned, and more commercially organized than the grim reputation allows. Medieval people were not chewing sadly on gray, unseasoned nothing and calling it dinner. They were buying hot pies from a street vendor and carrying them into a warm room full of noise and ale and eating them with their hands while someone next to them argued about the price of wool, which, if you strip away the century and swap the specifics, sounds like a night out that you could recognize without much effort at all. But the warmth of this room, and the pie in your hand, and the ale settling comfortably in your chest, might be giving you a slightly misleading impression of how the rest of this evening is going to go. Because the tavern is not just warm and social. The tavern is a place where things go wrong. And when things go wrong here, they go wrong fast, and they go wrong with weapons. The medieval tavern was a flashpoint for violence. That is not a dramatic exaggeration. It is a statistical reality, visible in coroners' rolls, court records, and legal proceedings from across the period. When you put ale in the cups and knives on the belts of 40 people crammed into a small, hot, poorly lit room with no security, no exits designed for crowd control, and no cultural expectation that disputes should be resolved with words instead of blades, the result is predictable, and the records are very specific. Stabbings are documented, brawls that started over spilled drinks, perceived insults, unpaid debts, gambling disputes, and arguments about absolutely nothing of consequence are recorded in detail because someone had to stand in front of a court and explain what happened. The coroner's rolls of medieval London read, in parts, like the incident reports of every rough bar in every city in every century since. A man was struck with a staff. A man was cut with a knife above the left eye. 2 men fought, and one fell, and the other fled, and was not seen again. The specifics change, the pattern does not. You are carrying a knife right now. Everyone in this room is carrying a knife. It is a tool, not a weapon, in the same way that a glass bottle in a modern pub is a drink container and not a weapon until suddenly, very quickly, it is. The line between a useful object and a dangerous one is exactly as thin as the temper of the person holding it. And ale has been eroding tempers in rooms like this since rooms like this existed. Self-defense claims were common. The courts heard them regularly and accepted them frequently because the legal framework understood that a room full of armed, drinking strangers was going to produce violence, whether the law approved or not. Fines varied. Outcomes depended heavily on social status, on who knew whom, on who had witnesses willing to say the right things, and on whether the victim survived. If a fight ended in death, the consequences were real, but if a fight ended in bruises and a broken bench, the resolution was often a fine and a warning and an unspoken understanding that it would happen again. The romantic version of the tavern brawl, the one where a chair sails across the room and everyone laughs and nobody really gets hurt, is a movie invention. The real version involved actual blades, actual blood, and actual coroner's inquests, recorded on actual parchment. The bar fight that starts over nothing and ends with someone being carried out is not a modern phenomenon. It is a medieval inheritance. A direct, unbroken line of human beings making terrible decisions in small rooms after too much to drink, stretching from this bench you are sitting on all the way to last Saturday night in a town you could probably name. The room is a little quieter now. The fire is still going. Your cup has been refilled. Or maybe you have switched to a smaller pour because the night is long and the conversation around you has shifted to something lower, something steadier. The violence is not happening right now. Most nights it does not. Most nights, the tavern is just this: noise, warmth, ale, company, and the slow unwinding of people who have worked all day and have nowhere better to be. And that ale you have been drinking all night, the one with no hops and no bitterness, and a shelf life shorter than your patience, it is not going to last. Not the cup in front of you, the drink itself. The entire tradition of English ale, brewed the way it has been brewed for centuries, is living on borrowed time, and the thing that is going to kill it is already here, arriving quietly in barrels from across the channel, carried by Flemish and Dutch immigrants who brought with them a single ingredient that will change everything: hops. You would not think a small green flower could start a trade war, but you would be underestimating how seriously the English took their ale. Hops had been used in continental brewing for centuries by this point. German and Low Country brewers had long understood that adding hops to the brewing process did 2 critical things. First, it introduced bitterness, which balanced the sweetness of the malt and created a flavor profile that was cleaner, sharper, and more recognizable to a modern palate. Second, and far more importantly from a business perspective, hops acted as a preservative. Hopped beer lasted weeks, sometimes months. Unhopped ale lasted days. That difference is not a minor technical footnote. It is the entire economic argument. If your product spoils in 3 days, you brew small batches constantly, you sell locally, and you lose everything that does not move fast enough. If your product lasts a month, you can brew in larger quantities, store it, ship it, and sell it over a much wider area. Hopped beer was not just a different drink, it was a different business model. And the English ale brewers hated it. Genuinely, passionately, institutionally hated it. Petitions were filed. Ordinances were passed. In some towns, the brewing of hopped beer was restricted or outright banned. The argument was framed as a matter of tradition, of English identity, of protecting the honest native ale from foreign contamination. The language in the complaints sounds remarkably like every trade protection argument that has ever been made about anything. Our product is traditional. Their product is foreign. Ours is pure. Theirs is adulterated. The ale brewers were not wrong that hopped beer was different. They were wrong that different meant worse. Because the economics were not on their side. A brewer using hops could produce more, store longer, waste less, and serve a wider market. A brewer without hops was locked into a cycle of constant small batch production with razor-thin margins and a product that started dying the moment it was born. The patriotic English ale was, from a pure business standpoint, the economically doomed product. The foreign hopped beer was the future, and no amount of petitioning was going to change the math. The transition took generations. It was not a clean switch. For a long time, ale and beer coexisted, served in the same establishments, consumed by the same people, regulated under slightly different rules. But slowly, steadily, hopped beer gained ground. By the late 15th and early 16th century, the balance had tipped. The drink in your cup tonight, in 1380-something, is still ale, pure, unhopped, sweet, cloudy, and temporary. But the clock is ticking on it, and the thing that will replace it is already being brewed a few streets away by immigrants who understand what the English ale trade is refusing to accept. That a product that lasts is a product that wins, regardless of how anyone feels about tradition. If you have ever watched a craft beer enthusiast explain why their small batch, locally brewed, carefully sourced ale is superior to the mass-produced lager in the next man's hand, you have seen this exact argument play out in reverse. The artisanal product versus the scalable one. The tradition versus the efficiency. The flavor versus the shelf life. 600 years and the debate has not found a new sentence. But hops and ale are not the only options available to you in this period, and the drink you are probably most curious about, the one that fantasy novels and period films have made famous, is one you are almost certainly not going to find in this room tonight. Mead. The legendary drink of warriors, of Viking halls, of medieval feasts lit by roaring fires, and soundtracked by heroic boasting. If you have read a fantasy novel or watched a film set anywhere between the 5th century and the 15th, mead has been presented to you as the default medieval drink, the thing everyone was sipping from horned cups while making dramatic speeches about honor. Here is the truth that the storybooks left out. Mead was rare, mead was expensive, and most people in this room have probably never tasted it. Mead is made from honey, and honey in medieval England was not cheap. It was the primary sweetener in a world where refined sugar was an exotic luxury import that cost more per pound than most spices. Honey was used in cooking, in medicine, in preserving, and in a dozen other applications that competed for the same limited supply. Beekeeping existed, but was not industrialized. The honey supply was small, the demand was wide, and the price reflected exactly what you would expect from that equation. Turning that expensive honey into a drink that took weeks or months to ferment was not something a working family did on a whim. Mead was a luxury. It appeared at wealthy tables, at special occasions, at religious feasts, and in the halls of people who could afford to use their honey for drinking, rather than for the dozen other things it was needed for. The common laborer sitting on this bench beside you did not order mead. He could not afford to order mead. He drank ale because ale was what existed in his price range, and mead was about as accessible to him as champagne is to someone working a minimum wage job today. Technically available, practically invisible. Mead's reputation as the universal medieval drink is one of the most successful pieces of historical marketing ever achieved by a product that almost nobody actually drank. Fantasy fiction has done more for Mead's brand recognition than Mead ever managed to do for itself. It is the medieval equivalent of a drink that is more famous in marketing materials than in anyone's actual glass. Cider existed too. Apple cider and perry, which is the pear version, were brewed in regions where orchards were common, particularly in the west and southwest of England. These were real drinks consumed by real people, but they were regional and seasonal. If you lived near apple trees, you probably drank cider at certain times of year. If you lived in London, you probably did not, unless it had been shipped in, which added cost and reduced freshness. Cider was not a national drink the way ale was. It was a local one. And then there is water. The claim that nobody in medieval England ever drank water is one of those myths that sounds correct and gets repeated so often that it has hardened into accepted fact. It is an exaggeration. People drank water. They drank it from springs, from known clean wells, from rural sources that were not contaminated by urban industry and human waste. Outside the cities, water was often perfectly safe and perfectly normal to drink. The danger was specific to urban water supplies, to the rivers and wells that shared space with tanneries, latrines, and the accumulated filth of a dense population. The blanket statement that medieval people never drank water is a modern overcorrection based on real urban problems, applied inaccurately to an entire civilization. But in this room, in this city, tonight, the overcorrection is close enough to true. You are not drinking the water here. Nobody sensible is. Your cup is back in front of you. Ale, still, the reliable option, the safe option. The option that costs a penny a gallon and keeps you alive and asks nothing of you except that you accept it, is not going to taste like anything brewed in your century. But how much is this night actually costing you? You have been here a while now. The cups have been refilled. The pie was a penny or two. The bench is free, but the ale is not. And somewhere in the back of your mind, the part that is still sober is starting to do the arithmetic. Let us lay it out. A gallon of basic ale costs 1 penny. That is your foundation. If you are drinking steadily over the course of an evening, you might go through a gallon, possibly more if the night stretches long. Call it a penny for the ale. The food you brought in from the cookshop, the pie or the bowl of pottage, cost you another penny, maybe 2, if you went for something more substantial or came back for a second round. So your basic evening, ale and food, is sitting at roughly 2 to 3 pence. Now, if you decided to order wine, and you did not, but let us imagine you did, the numbers change dramatically. A gallon of Gascon wine at 8 pence or more is a different conversation entirely. Even a single cup of wine, a fraction of a gallon, might cost you 2 or 3 pence on its own. 1 cup of wine equals your entire evening's spending on ale and food combined. The man at the next table who has been drinking wine all night has spent more on his evening than you will earn this week. Add the extras. If you gambled, and many people in this room are gambling, your losses could be anything from a farthing to a small disaster, depending on your luck and your self-control. If you need a bed for the night, a shared bed in the room upstairs, that might cost another penny or 2. If you stay past curfew and get caught, the fine lands on top of everything else. A laborer in 1480-something London earned roughly 2 pence a day. A skilled craftsman might earn 4 to 6 pence. A merchant or a minor professional might earn considerably more. But the laborer is the useful benchmark, because the laborer is the person for whom these costs are felt most sharply. Your basic night out on ale and a pie has cost you 2 to 3 pence. That is a full day's wages, possibly more, for a single evening of drinking and eating in a room that smells like smoke and old rushes. If you do this twice a week, you are spending 2 full days of labor per week on tavern visits alone. That is not disposable income being casually spent. That is a significant portion of a working person's earnings being funneled into the only social infrastructure available to someone at the bottom of the economic ladder. Now translate that into something you can feel today. If a day's labor at minimum wage is roughly $80 to $100, then a night at the tavern costs the medieval equivalent of $80 to $100 for ale and a pie, in a room with a compost floor. The modern version of this would be spending your entire daily paycheck on a night at a bar that does not have chairs, and then going back 2 days later and doing it again. The proportions are not romantic, they are heavy, and they fell heaviest on the people who could least afford them. which is a pattern that has survived intact across 600 years of economic evolution and shows absolutely no sign of correcting itself. The thing about this room is that the money being spent here, penny by penny, cup by cup, is flowing upward, and the people spending it are not the people it flows to. But that is a thread we will follow later when the night gets quieter and the economics get darker. For now, the ale is in your cup, and the room is still full, and the question is not just what you are drinking, but who you are drinking with. Because the crowd in this room is not what you expect. The default image of a medieval tavern is a room full of rough, working-class men. Laborers, soldiers, drifters, criminals, a masculine space, a dangerous space, a space where respectable people did not go. That image is wrong, not entirely wrong, because laborers and soldiers and people of questionable intent are certainly here. But the full picture is considerably wider than the stereotype allows. Women drank in taverns. That is not a progressive exception. It is a documented norm. Women appear in court records, in tavern regulations, in accounts of tavern life, as customers, not just as alewives serving from behind a counter. They drank, they socialized, they participated in the same activities as the men around them. The idea that the medieval tavern was an exclusively male space is a projection of much later social norms backward onto a period that did not share them. Clergy drank in taverns. They were told not to. Church authorities issued repeated condemnations of priests and monks frequenting alehouses and taverns, which tells you two things simultaneously. One, that the church considered it inappropriate. Two, that it was happening so frequently that the church felt the need to keep saying so. A prohibition that needs to be restated every few years is a prohibition that is not working. The clergy were in the tavern. They were always in the tavern. And the church's official position on the matter was roughly as effective as a sign in a pub asking people to please keep the noise down. Merchants, minor gentry, traveling officials, students, visiting tradesmen, off-duty servants, and people who fit no neat category at all shared this space. The medieval tavern was, in many ways, one of the most socially mixed environments in a world that was otherwise rigidly stratified. The manor house had a seating chart. The church had a hierarchy. The guild hall had membership requirements. The tavern had a bench, and the bench did not care who you were, only whether you could pay for what was in front of you. That is not to say the mixing was comfortable or equal. Status differences did not disappear at the door. The man drinking wine was visibly, deliberately distinguishing himself from the man drinking ale, and everyone understood the signal. Wealthier patrons might sit closer to the fire, or in a slightly less crowded part of the room. The social choreography was present, even in a space that nominally ignored rank. But the physical proximity was real. In this room, right now, a laborer's elbow is a few inches from a merchant's sleeve, and that contact, that shared air and shared noise and shared fire, was rarer than you might think, in a world that worked very hard to keep people in their assigned places. The dive bar, where you might find a lawyer and a construction worker and an off-duty nurse on the same Wednesday night at 11. That energy is not new. It has been running uninterrupted since the 14th century, in rooms very much like this one, filled with people who came for the same reasons you would. Not because the ale was exceptional, not because the room was beautiful, because it was warm, and it was open, and it was the one place in a long, hard day where nobody expected you to be anywhere else. The night is settling now. The loudest voices in the room have either gone home or gone hoarse, and the fire has burned down to a steadier, quieter glow. The ale in your cup is warm. Your shoulders have loosened. The bench does not feel as hard as it did 2 hours ago, or maybe you have just stopped noticing. The room is still full, but the energy has shifted from the bright, sharp noise of early evening into something lower and more familiar. This is the part of the night where conversation slows down and the room starts to breathe. But even now, even in this softer hour, the law is watching. And the law in medieval England had remarkably specific opinions about what you are doing in this room, how long you are allowed to do it, and exactly what happens when you cross a line that you may not have known was there. Drinking in medieval England was not an unregulated activity. It was one of the most regulated activities in daily civic life. The Crown, the local authorities, and the Church all had positions on who could sell ale, how much it could cost, when it could be served, and what behaviors were acceptable inside the establishments that served it. The framework was detailed, overlapping, and frequently contradictory, which is what happens when three different power structures all try to control the same room at the same time. The Assize of ale, which you have already met through the alewife's experience of it, controlled prices and quality. But that was only one layer. Licensing controlled who could sell in the first place. Not everyone who brewed could legally sell. Operating without a license was an offense, though it was an offense committed so widely and so constantly that the fines generated by unlicensed alehouses became, over time, a reliable revenue stream for local courts. The system did not eliminate illegal brewing. It taxed it, which tells you everything you need to know about whether the goal was order or income. Then there was curfew. The curfew bell, from the Norman French couvre-feu, meaning cover the fire, rang in the evening and signaled two things. First, that fires should be banked or covered for safety, because a city built primarily of timber and thatch had a relationship with fire that was less cozy than it was existential. Second, that people should be off the streets and taverns should be closing. The curfew was real. The bell was real. The expectation that you would hear it and obediently finish your drink and walk home through the dark was also real, in the sense that it existed on paper and was enforced with the consistency of a New Year's resolution. People stayed past curfew. Of course they stayed past curfew. The court records are full of fines for drinking after the bell, for serving after the bell, for being found in a tavern when the tavern was supposed to be closed. If everyone had obediently gone home when the bell rang, there would be no records. The records exist because the violations were constant, which means the curfew functioned less as a rule that was followed, and more as a rule that generated fines when it was not. The law was comprehensive and comprehensively ignored, and the gap between the two was where the money was. Specific activities were regulated inside the tavern as well. Dice games were periodically banned. Card games, when they arrived later in the period, faced similar restrictions. The bans were motivated partly by moral concern, because gambling led to debt, which led to disputes, which led to the kind of violence that ended up in coroners' rolls, and partly by practical concern, because a room full of people gambling was a room full of people not working, and the authorities preferred the second option. Whether the bans worked is answered by the fact that they had to be reissued repeatedly across decades. A law that needs to be restated every few years is a law that exists primarily as a statement of intent rather than a description of reality. The fines for these offenses were not trivial. Breaking curfew might cost you a few pence. Repeat offenses escalated. Operating without a license could result in fines that represented days or weeks of income, and the fines fell, as fines tend to, most heavily on the people least able to absorb them. The laborer caught drinking after curfew lost a day's wages to the fine. The alewife caught serving after hours lost significantly more. The system punished the bottom of the ladder with a weight that the top of the ladder would barely have noticed. The modern parking ticket that costs the same £20 whether you earn $20,000 a year or $200,000 has a very old ancestor sitting in the court rolls of 14th century London. And yet the laws existed for reasons that were not entirely cynical. The fire risk was genuine, a city where open flames were the only source of heat and light and cooking. A city built of wood and straw and pitch was a city that lived one careless moment away from catastrophe. The curfew was not just about controlling behavior. It was about preventing the entire neighborhood from burning down because someone fell asleep with a candle still lit after a long night of ale. The gambling bans, however poorly enforced, reflected a real awareness that debt spirals destroyed families, and that the tavern was the place where those spirals most often began. The regulations were imperfect, selectively enforced, and frequently exploited for revenue. But underneath the corruption and the inconsistency, there was a genuine attempt to manage the risks of a room full of fire, alcohol, and human impulsivity. The attempt failed regularly, but it was made. The curfew bell has not rung yet tonight. You still have time, and the room around you, now that the initial rush has settled, is not just drinking. It is doing something else entirely. It is playing. Dice are out on the table across from you. Two men hunched over a small flat surface, shaking, throwing, arguing, in a tone that could be anger or could be excitement, and honestly, could be both at the same time. Dice games were the most common form of tavern entertainment in medieval England and the most frequently condemned. The games were simple, fast, and dangerously easy to bet on. You did not need to understand complex rules. You needed a pair of dice, an opponent, and money you were willing to lose. The barrier to entry was zero, and the barrier to exit was your own self-control, which, after several cups of ale in a warm room, was not operating at peak capacity. Other games existed. Board games, including early versions of backgammon and chess, appeared in taverns, though chess was more associated with the wealthy. Simpler games involving stones, tokens, or marked pieces were common. Card games arrived later in the period, imported from the continent, and quickly became popular enough to attract the same bands and the same fines that dice had been collecting for generations. But the primary entertainment in a medieval tavern was not a game. It was noise, conversation, argument, singing, sometimes organized, more often not. Someone in the corner right now is singing something that might be a ballad, or might be a complaint, or might be a sound that has no category beyond the enthusiasm of the person producing it. The quality is irrelevant, the volume is not inconsiderable, and nobody is asking him to stop, because this is what the room is for. Minstrels and traveling entertainers sometimes appeared in larger taverns or inns. A musician with a fiddle or a pipe, a storyteller who could hold a room for an hour, a juggler who worked for tips and ale. But these were occasional visitors, not fixtures. The everyday entertainment was each other. The room itself was the entertainment, the density of people, the warmth, the ale, the freedom to talk and argue and laugh without the constraints that governed almost every other social space in medieval life. The church expected reverence. The workplace expected labor. The manor expected deference. The tavern expected you to buy a drink, and then it mostly left you alone. The sound of dice on wood, a voice raised in a song that nobody else seems to know the words to. Two women on the bench behind you, having a conversation that keeps dissolving into laughter. The fire popping, a cup set down hard enough to make the table jump. This is the soundtrack of the medieval tavern, and it is not quiet, it is not refined, and it is not trying to be either of those things. It is the sound of people being people in the one room that lets them. The pub quiz, the jukebox, the darts board, the guy who always starts singing after his fourth pint. The playlist changes. The behavior does not. It has never changed. It was always this. Now. That cup in your hand. The one that has been refilled twice tonight. The one made from wood or rough ceramic. The one that may or may not have been properly washed since the last person used it. Let us follow it backward. Not the cup itself, but what is inside it. Let us trace a single serving of ale from the moment the grain was planted to the moment it reaches your mouth, and let us see who touches it, who profits from it, and who is left holding the least when the accounting is done. The grain starts in a field, not a field owned by the farmer who works it, in most cases, but a field belonging to a lord or an institution, worked by a tenant who pays rent in labor, in kind, or in coin. The tenant farmer grows the barley or the wheat or the oats, tends it through the season, harvests it, and then surrenders a portion to the lord as rent. What remains is his to sell or use. Some of it goes to feed his family. Some of it goes to market. Some of it is sold to the alewife down the road, who needs grain to brew. The alewife buys the grain at market price, which she does not control. She carries it home. She malts it, which means soaking it, allowing it to germinate, and then drying it to stop the process. This takes time, space, and fuel. The fuel is firewood, and firewood is not free. Gathering it takes labor. Buying it takes money. The fire that heats the malt, that boils the water, that warms the room where she sells the finished product, all of it runs on wood that must be sourced, transported, and either purchased or collected at the cost of hours she could have spent doing something else. She brews the ale. The process takes days. She monitors the fermentation, judges the readiness, and prepares to sell. The ale is at its best for roughly 2 to 3 days after brewing. Every hour that passes after that, the product is deteriorating. She is in a race against biology, and biology does not extend deadlines. She sells the ale from her front room at a price she did not set. The Assize of ale dictates the price based on the current cost of grain. If grain is expensive, her price goes up slightly. If grain is cheap, her price goes down. The margin, the gap between what she spent on grain, fuel, labor, and equipment, and what she receives per gallon, is thin. Some historians have estimated that many alewives operated at barely more than subsistence level, brewing not to build wealth, but to supplement a household income that was not sufficient on its own. From that thin margin, she pays rent on her property. She pays licensing fees, or absorbs the fines that come from operating without a license, because obtaining a license also costs money. She pays the fines that the ale taster levies when her product does not pass inspection, and those fines are not scaled to her income. They are flat amounts that hurt her more than they would hurt anyone above her in the chain. The landlord takes rent. The landlord may be a private individual, a religious house, or the crown itself. The landlord's income from the property is steady, predictable, and unaffected by whether the ale is good or bad, whether the alewife is profitable or drowning. Rent is rent. It does not care about your margins. The crown takes its cut through licensing, through fines, and through the general taxation framework that applies to commercial activity. The ale taster enforces the standards that generate the fines. The grain merchant sold the raw material at a price set by market conditions the alewife cannot influence. The firewood seller charged what the market would bear. By the time that cup of ale reaches your hand, 6 or 7 different people and institutions have taken their share. The farmer grew the grain and surrendered a portion in rent. The merchant sold it at market price. The alewife bought it, processed it, brewed it, and served it. The landlord collected rent. The crown collected fees. The ale taster collected his due. And the person who did the most work, who invested the most hours, who bore the most legal and financial risk, who faced the cucking stool if the product was judged inadequate, is the woman who poured your drink. Her share of the penny you paid is whatever is left after everyone else has been satisfied, and what is left is very often not much at all. 1 penny, that is what you paid. And by the time that penny is divided among everyone who had a claim on it, the woman who turned grain into ale and served it to you in her own home is standing at the bottom of a chain that extracted more from her labor than it returned to her. This is not a modern analysis imposed on a medieval system. This is the system, visible in the records, documented in the fines, and repeated in every town and city across England for centuries. Step back now. Step out of the economics for a moment and look at this room the way the people inside it see it. Not as a business, not as a regulatory headache, not as a source of fines and licensing revenue. Look at it the way the laborer who just sat down sees it, the way the alewife herself sees it when the last customer has gone and the fire is low and the room is finally quiet. This is the living room of the community, not metaphorically, functionally. In a world without public meeting halls accessible to ordinary people, without newspapers, without telephones, without any mechanism for the rapid exchange of information among the working and trading classes, the tavern filled every gap. News traveled through this room. A merchant arriving from Bristol brought word of prices in the west. A traveler from the north carried rumors of weather, of harvest, of trouble on the roads. The things you needed to know to make decisions about your own life, about when to sell, when to buy, when to travel, when to stay, arrived in this room on the voices of people who had been somewhere you had not. Business was conducted over ale. Deals were struck. Debts were negotiated. Labor was hired. If you needed a man to help you move goods, you found him on this bench. If you needed to settle a dispute without involving the courts, you did it here, with witnesses who would remember the terms because they were sitting close enough to hear every word. The tavern was an informal courthouse, an employment office, and a trading floor, all operating under the cover of a social evening. Relationships were built and broken in this room. Friendships, alliances, rivalries, romances. The tavern was where people encountered each other, outside the rigid structures of work and church and household. It was the one space where the interaction was, if not free, then at least freer. You could speak more openly here than you could in the manor. You could sit more comfortably here than you could in the pew. You could be more yourself here, or at least a version of yourself that was not performing deference or piety or labor for someone else's benefit. The coffee house, the co-working space, the local bar where everyone knows your name and the bartender remembers your order. The tavern was all of these compressed into one low-ceilinged, smoke-filled, rush-floored room. It was infrastructure, not glamorous infrastructure, not clean infrastructure, but infrastructure that held the social fabric of a community together in ways that the people inside it probably never thought about, and certainly never called infrastructure. They just called it the tavern, and they went there every night because the alternative was going home to a cold room and sitting in the dark and knowing nothing about the world beyond your own door. The fire is lower now, the room is thinning, and the night, your night, still has a few chapters left in it. The fire is settling into its quieter self now, the kind of glow that does not demand attention, just offers warmth to whoever is still close enough to feel it. The room has thinned slightly. A few benches have opened up. The ale is still coming, but the pace has slowed, and the conversations around you have dropped into that lower register, where people stop performing for the room and start actually talking. This is the part of the evening where the tavern shows you something it does not advertise. The business underneath the business. The structure that holds this room up and takes its cut from every cup you have emptied tonight. Because the woman who brewed your ale and served it from her front room and absorbed the fines and risked the cucking stool does not, in most cases, own this building. The room you are sitting in belongs to someone else, and the someone else is, more often than you might expect, not a person at all. Tavern properties in medieval England were owned by landlords, by wealthy families, by commercial investors, and, with a frequency that borders on satire, by the church. Religious institutions, monasteries, abbeys, and cathedral chapters owned a remarkable number of properties that operated as alehouses and taverns. The same church that publicly condemned the moral dangers of drinking, that issued sermons against the sins of the alehouse, that warned its clergy to stay away from these establishments, was simultaneously collecting rent from the buildings where all of that sinning was taking place. This was not a secret. It was not hidden in obscure records that only modern historians have uncovered. It was a known and accepted feature of the medieval property landscape. Religious houses were major landowners. They owned urban property portfolios that included shops, houses, warehouses, and drinking establishments. The rental income from these properties funded the institutions that denounced the activities happening inside them. The moral position and the financial position existed in perfect, comfortable contradiction, and nobody involved saw any particular need to resolve it. The alewife paid rent to the landlord. The rent was fixed regardless of how her business performed. A bad batch of ale, a slow week, a fine from the ale taster, none of these reduced her rent by a single penny. The landlord's income was insulated from every risk that the alewife faced. If she failed, another tenant would take her place. The building continued to generate income. The institution continued to collect. The person doing the labor was the replaceable part of the equation, and the person collecting the rent was the permanent one. The Crown extracted its share through licensing and through the court system. Operating a drinking establishment required permission, and permission cost money. Fines for regulatory violations were not incidental revenue. They were a reliable, recurring income stream that the courts had no particular incentive to eliminate. A system that depends on fines for its funding is a system that needs violations to continue. The regulations were strict enough that violations were inevitable, and the fines were moderate enough that most operators paid them and continued rather than closing. The sweet spot, from the Crown's perspective, was a level of enforcement that generated maximum revenue without shutting down the businesses that produced it. This is not cynicism. This is the recorded financial reality of medieval municipal governance. And here, in the quieter part of the evening, is where the quiet ruin lives. Not in the noise and the laughter and the full cups, in the records, in the names that appear and then stop appearing. There is a particular kind of story that shows up in medieval court rolls and property records if you read them long enough. A name appears. An alewife, a tavern keeper, an operator of a small alehouse in a specific parish. She is fined for short measure. She is fined again the following year. The fines appear in the rolls like a slow drumbeat. A fine for weak ale. A fine for selling after hours. A fine for operating without a renewed license. Each one is survivable on its own. Each one is a small cut, but the cuts accumulate. And then the name stops. It does not end with a dramatic event. There is no record of a cucking stool, no record of a closure order. The name simply ceases to appear. Someone else is listed at that address. The building is still operating. The rent is still being collected. The ale is still being sold. But the woman whose name was there last year is gone, replaced by another name that will, in its own time, begin accumulating its own small cuts. That is what failure looked like in this economy. Not a crash, not a public ruin, a slow disappearance. A name that runs out of room to absorb the costs that the system above it kept applying. The landlord barely noticed. The Crown barely noticed. The records noticed, because records are indifferent in a way that people rarely are, and the absence of a name is just as legible as its presence if you know what the silence means. The woman pouring your ale tonight may be one of the ones who lasted, or she may be the one whose name is about to stop appearing. You would not know from looking at her. She is working. The cups are moving. The room is warm, and the structure above her is extracting what it extracts, steadily, quietly, and without any interest in whether she can sustain it. The hour is getting late now. The ale has been settling in you for a while, and the bench is starting to feel less like furniture and more like an old friend. The fire is low. The room is warm, in that deep, soaked way that only comes from hours of bodies and flame in a small space, and your eyelids are doing something you did not authorize, but you are not going home tonight. You cannot. Home is 2 days' ride from here, and the streets outside are dark in a way that modern darkness does not prepare you for. You are staying, which means you are going upstairs. The overnight accommodation in a medieval tavern or inn was not what the word accommodation has trained you to expect. There was no room with your name on it. There was no key. There was, in many establishments, no room that belonged to you alone at all. What there was, in the simplest and most common arrangement, was a bed, and in that bed there would be other people. Shared beds were the norm, not the exception. A traveler, arriving at a tavern or inn for the night, rented a space in a bed, not the bed itself. You might share with one other person. You might share with two. The people beside you were strangers. You did not choose them. They did not choose you. The arrangement was commercial, practical, and entirely unremarkable to everyone involved. The concept of a private room, a space that belonged to you alone for the night, existed, but it existed at a price point that most travelers could not justify. Privacy was a luxury, and like most luxuries in this period, it was priced accordingly. The bed itself was not what you are picturing. If you are imagining a mattress, even a rough one, you are being optimistic. A straw-filled sack on a wooden frame was the standard. The straw was changed with a frequency that depended entirely on the establishment and the operator and the season, and in many cases, the frequency could be described most charitably as eventual. The blanket, if there was one, was shared. The pillow, if there was one, was not guaranteed to be yours alone. The room smelled like sleep, like bodies and straw, and the faint sour undertone of a space that has been breathed in and sweated in by an uncountable number of people over an uncountable number of nights. The sounds from the tavern below filtered up through the floorboards. A laugh, a scrape of a bench, the murmur of the last few drinkers who had not yet surrendered to the hour. You lay down next to a stranger, and you closed your eyes and you hoped, with the quiet optimism of every traveler in every century, that the person beside you was honest, that your belongings would still be where you left them in the morning, and that whatever was living in the straw was going to leave you alone for the next few hours. Theft was a real and constant concern. Your belongings, your money, your knife, your boots, these were all vulnerable the moment you fell asleep. Experienced travelers slept with their valuables close to their body or underneath them. Trust was not the operating principle. Caution was, and even caution was not a guarantee, because the person sleeping next to you had exactly the same access to your things that you had to theirs, and the dark was the dark, and a skilled hand in a sleeping room full of strangers had been a professional hazard of travel since travel began. The hostile dorm room experience. The one where you lock your bag to the bed frame and sleep with one ear open and hope the person in the next bunk is not the reason you wake up lighter than you went to sleep. That experience is not modern. It is ancient. The infrastructure has changed. The architecture has changed. The fundamental anxiety of sleeping among strangers in a room you do not control has not changed at all. And yet, people did it. Every night, in every town with a tavern or an inn, travelers laid down in shared beds in rooms above the noise and slept, because the alternative was the street, and the street after dark in medieval London was a proposition that made the shared bed look genuinely appealing by comparison. But not everyone in this room tonight is a traveler. Not everyone is here for the first time or the last time. Some of the people on these benches are here every single night, and the tavern knows them the way a neighborhood bar knows its regulars, which is to say, it knows everything. The medieval tavern was a gossip engine of extraordinary efficiency. In a world without mass media, without printed news, without any mechanism for the rapid distribution of information to ordinary people, the tavern was where reputation was built, maintained, damaged, and destroyed. What was said about you in this room mattered. It mattered because the people in this room were the same people you traded with, worked alongside, borrowed from, lent to, and depended on for the small daily transactions that held a medieval life together. The regulars knew each other. They knew who paid their debts and who did not. They knew who could be trusted with a handshake agreement and who needed a witness. They knew who drank too much and who kept their head. They knew whose wife was unhappy and whose business was failing and whose son had been seen with the wrong company. The tavern was a surveillance network, powered entirely by ale and proximity, and it operated with a thoroughness that no formal institution could match. Your reputation followed you into this room, and it followed you out again, altered by whatever had been observed, overheard, or invented about you during the hours in between. A man who was generous with his rounds built social capital. A man who was tight with his money eroded it. A woman seen too often in the tavern might find her reputation questioned, not because the tavern was forbidden to her, but because frequency of presence was subject to interpretation, and interpretation in a small community was rarely charitable. The regulars also formed a kind of informal community. They watched out for each other's interests in the vague, unspoken way that people who share a space regularly tend to do. They warned each other about bad deals. They shared information about work opportunities. They noticed when someone was absent who was usually present, and the noticing itself was a kind of social safety net, thin and unreliable, but real. The modern equivalent is the local, where the bartender knows your name and your order, and roughly how your week has been. The place where walking in feels like arriving, rather than entering. The tavern regulars in 1480-something London had that feeling, that sense of belonging to a place that was not home, but was adjacent to home, in a way that mattered. And they came back, night after night, spending money they could barely afford, sitting on benches above a floor they tried not to think about, drinking ale that would not last the week, because the room offered something that the rest of their lives did not. It offered company without obligation, warmth without cost, beyond the penny in the cup, and the simple, ancient, irreplaceable comfort of being known. The curfew bell is going to ring soon. You can feel it in the room, the way you can feel last call in a modern bar before anyone announces it. The energy has shifted. Not stopped, not gone, just tilted gently toward the door. A few people have already left. The bench beside you has a gap in it where a man was sitting an hour ago, and his absence is the kind of small, ordinary disappearing that nobody remarks on because it happens at this hour every night. The fire is embers now, not dead, not cold, but finished with the business of lighting the room and settled into the quieter work of just keeping the chill away from whoever is still close enough to care. The curfew itself is an old rule by the time you are sitting here. Couvre-feu, cover the fire. The word is Norman French, and it arrived with the conquest, though the practice of ringing a bell to signal the end of the public evening likely predates the specific terminology. The idea was practical before it was legal. A city built from timber and thatch, a city where every room contained an open flame, a city where the gap between a controlled hearth fire and an uncontrolled building fire was exactly as wide as one drunk person's carelessness, needed a mechanism for limiting the hours during which flames were burning unsupervised. The curfew bell was that mechanism. When it rang, you covered your fire, you banked the coals, you reduced the chances of waking up to a street on fire. It was not optional. It was public safety, in its most basic, most necessary form. But the curfew was also a social instrument. When the bell rang, taverns were supposed to close. Customers were supposed to leave. The streets were supposed to empty. The night was supposed to become the domain of the watch, and only the watch. Supposed to is doing a great deal of work in those sentences, because the reality, as you have already seen with every other regulation that applied to this room, was more flexible than the law intended. Tavern keepers who served after curfew were fined. Customers found drinking after curfew were fined. The fines were real, but they were not ruinous. And for an alewife whose best customers arrived late and stayed later, the calculation was straightforward. The fine for serving after hours was a known cost. The lost revenue from closing on time was also a known cost. When the fine was smaller than the revenue, the door stayed open, and the ale kept pouring, and the curfew bell rang into a room that politely acknowledged its existence and then carried on. The law and the reality maintained their familiar distance from each other, close enough to be related, far enough apart to function independently. The watch moved through the streets after dark. These were appointed men, sometimes volunteers, sometimes drafted into the role the same way ale tasters were, whose job was to patrol the city during the hours when most people were supposed to be inside. They carried lanterns. They challenged strangers. They were, in theory, the law enforcement presence that kept the dark hours safe. In practice, the watch was understaffed, underpaid when it was paid at all, inconsistently motivated, and operating in conditions that made effective policing nearly impossible. The streets after curfew were dark, not dim, not poorly lit, dark. There were no streetlights. There was no ambient glow from neighboring buildings. The The moon, when it was present, was the only light source that the city did not have to pay for, and the moon was not on a reliable schedule. The watch did their best, or they did something adjacent to their best, or they stayed near the fire at the watch house and ventured out only when the noise of a disturbance was loud enough to make ignoring it feel professionally irresponsible. The quality of the watch varied by neighborhood, by season, by the disposition of the men assigned, and by the general enthusiasm of a city for funding a service that most citizens preferred to avoid needing. If the medieval watch has a modern descendant, it is the overnight security guard at a building where nothing usually happens, walking a route he has walked 1,000 times, hoping that tonight is another night where nothing requires him to do anything beyond walking and hoping. But you are still inside. The bell has not rung yet, or perhaps it has rung, and you have made the decision to stay, and the alewife has made the decision to let you, and both of you understand the terms of the arrangement without needing to discuss them. The room is very quiet now, not silent. A tavern is never silent while there are still people in it, but the particular quality of noise has changed from a roar to a murmur to something that is almost a hum. The low, warm, barely audible sound of a few people existing in the same space at the end of a long day with nowhere urgent to be. The candles, if there were any left, have been pinched out. The tallow smell lingers, but it is fading, dissolving into the larger smell of the room, which is smoke and ale and warmth and rush and all the accumulated hours of human presence that have soaked into the walls and the ceiling and the bench you are sitting on. Your cup is empty. It has been empty for a while. You have not asked for a refill because the night has crossed that invisible threshold where another drink would be a decision rather than a continuation, and you are not making that decision. You are just sitting. This is the last version of the tavern, the one that exists after the noise and the food and the gambling and the arguments and the singing and the arrivals and the departures. The version that is just a warm room with a dying fire and a few people who are not ready to leave yet. Not because they are having a good time, exactly, though maybe they are, because leaving means the night is over, and the cold is outside, and the dark is between here and home, for many of the people still on this bench, is a room that is smaller and colder and quieter than this one. The tavern at closing time is not exciting. It is not interesting. It is just warm. And sometimes, warm is enough. The door opens. Cold air threads into the room and finds you immediately, slipping between the warmth you have been sitting in for hours and reminding your body that the season exists and has not been canceled just because you were comfortable. You stand. Your legs are stiff. Your back remembers the bench in a way your back is going to keep remembering for the next 2 days. The rushes crunch under your boots one last time, and you do not look down, and you do not think about what crunched, and you walk toward the door. The street hits you differently than the room did when you entered. When you arrived, the noise came first. Now the silence does. Not true silence, because a medieval city is never truly silent, but the dramatic reduction from the contained, compressed sound of the tavern to the open, scattered, almost empty sound of a street at night. Somewhere a dog is barking. Somewhere further away, a voice is saying something you cannot make out. The rest is just the city, breathing in its sleep. The dark is the thing you notice most. You knew it would be dark, but you did not know it would be this dark. The modern experience of darkness, even deep darkness, almost always contains some ambient light. A street lamp a block away. A lit window. The faint glow of a city reflected off clouds. Medieval darkness does not contain these things. What it contains is the moon, if the moon is out, and the stars, if the clouds allow it, and your own memory of the route between the tavern and wherever you are going. Your eyes adjust, but they adjust to a level of visibility that is startlingly low. Shapes exist, details do not. The person walking toward you from the other end of the street is a silhouette until they are close enough to touch, and by the time they are close enough to touch, the question of whether they are friendly is a question you needed answered 30 seconds ago. The streets themselves are an obstacle course, that the daylight conveniently hid from you. The lanes are narrow and uneven. The surface is packed earth or rough stone, rutted from cartwheels, and interrupted by drainage channels that carry things you do not want to step in, and which are nearly invisible in the dark. There are no curbs. There are no railings. There are no reflective markers or painted lines, or any of the small, forgettable pieces of infrastructure that guide a modern person through a modern city at night, without requiring them to think about it. Here, you think about every step, because every step is a negotiation with a surface that was not designed for nighttime foot traffic and has no interest in your safe arrival anywhere. The smell of the street is different from the smell of the tavern, sharper, more biological. The drainage channels are doing what drainage channels do, and what they do is carry waste, human and animal and industrial, through open channels that run alongside or down the middle of the street. In daylight, you could see them and step around them. In the dark, you navigate by memory and by the smell itself, which serves as a kind of warning system. If it gets worse, you are getting closer to something you do not want to be closer to. The nose, in the absence of every other navigational aid, becomes remarkably useful. The walk home, if home is nearby, is short but not safe. The risk of robbery was real. The risk of assault was real. The risk of simply falling into something, tripping over something, or walking into something that the dark had hidden from you was real and embarrassingly common. Court records document injuries sustained by people walking home after dark that range from the serious to the faintly comic, though the comedy is easier to appreciate 600 years later than it was at the time. A man fell into a ditch. A man walked into a wall. A man stepped into the river. The city after dark was an environment that punished the unwary and did not distinguish between the drunk and the merely disoriented. If you were smart, and you are, you walked quickly. You stayed near the middle of the street where the footing was slightly more predictable. You kept your hand near your knife, not because you expected to use it, but because the weight of it was reassuring in the way that locking your car door is reassuring in a dark parking lot. You listened more than you looked because your ears were more useful than your eyes in conditions where seeing past 10 feet was an achievement. And you moved with the particular combination of confidence and caution that every person who has ever walked home alone through a dark city at a late hour recognizes instinctively, the pace that says, "I know where I am going, and I am not afraid, but I am also not stopping." The modern walk home from the bar at 2 in the morning, the one where you keep your phone in your pocket and your keys in your hand, and you take the well-lit street even though the dark alley is shorter. That walk is this walk. The lighting has changed. The surface has improved. The drainage situation is, mercifully, no longer your problem, but the feeling is the same. The particular alertness of a person moving through a space that belongs to the night rather than to them. That feeling is 600 years old at minimum, and it was old when this city was new. You make it home, or you make it to wherever you are sleeping tonight. Whether that is a rented bed above the tavern with a stranger's shoulder against yours, or a room in an inn that smells like straw and tallow, or your own small house in a lane off the main street, where the door is bolted from the inside, and the fire is long cold, and the dark is just as dark as the dark outside, but at least it is yours. You are done. The night at the tavern is over. The ale is in your blood, and the smoke is in your clothes, and the penny you spent is in the alewife's keeping, and tomorrow it will be in someone else's keeping, moving upward through the system the way pennies always move, away from the hand that earned them. And now, gently, let us step out of that room. Let us step out of that century. Let us leave the smoke and the rushes, and the low ceilings and the warm ale, and come back to wherever you are right now, lying in a bed that belongs to you alone. In a room where the air is clean and the floor is solid, and the water from the tap will not hurt you, and nobody is going to test your drink by sitting in it. The people you spent tonight with were real. Not all of them, not specifically, but the types, the roles, the lives, Those were lived by actual human beings, in actual rooms, in actual cities, that you could walk through today if the buildings were still standing. The alewife who brewed before dawn and sold all day, and paid her fines, and absorbed her risks, and fed her children from the margins of a system that was designed to extract from her rather than to support her. She was real. Her name is in a court roll somewhere, one of thousands, a line of ink on parchment that records a fine for short measure or weak ale. And behind that line is an entire life that the record does not bother to describe because the record was not interested in her life. It was interested in her money. The laborer who spent a full day's wages on ale and a pie because the tavern was the only room in his world that offered warmth and company and noise without asking him to work for it. He was real. He went back the next night and the night after that, and he spent money he could not comfortably spend because the alternative was silence and cold, and the four walls of a room that had nothing in it but a straw bed and the smell of his own tiredness. The traveler who slept in a shared bed and hoped for the best. The dice player who lost more than he meant to. The merchant who ordered wine to prove a point that everyone understood and nobody respected. The ale taster sitting in his leather breeches on a bench, conducting the quality control that an entire industry depended on. The clergy who were not supposed to be here and were always here. The women who drank and talked and laughed in a room that later centuries would try to pretend they never entered. They were all real, every one of them, living lives that were harder than yours, in ways that are easy to list and just as human as yours, in ways that are harder to measure. They were not simpler than you. They were not rougher or duller or less aware of the gap between the way things were and the way things should have been. They noticed the unfairness. They felt the weight of the fines and the rent and the regulations that applied to them and not to the people above them. They laughed at the ale taster the same way you did when you heard about it tonight. They complained about the prices. They complained about the wine. They stayed too late and regretted it in the morning and went back and did it again because the tavern was the one room in a constrained, demanding, exhausting life that asked nothing of them but a penny and their presence. Spare a quiet thought for them tonight, the real ones. Not the characters in a story, not the background figures in a painting, but the actual people who sat on those benches and drank that ale and walked home through those dark streets and woke up the next morning and did it all again. They were just as clever as you, just as foolish, just as stubborn, and just as wonderfully, irreducibly human. The tavern is closed now. The fire has gone out. The rushes are settling into whatever the rushes become when nobody is watching. The street is dark and quiet, and the curfew bell has long since stopped ringing. Rest easy, breathe slow, and let the old room fade softly into the dark.